Chapter 9, Lesson 3 is going to deal with the country of Iraq. Right there, found in the Middle East. Now, we have already talked quite extensively about Iraq, and in fact, last year you learned a little bit about Iraq as well. But last year, if you remember correctly, and earlier this year, we called it Mesopotamia. Now, we know from what we learned previously in class that Mesopotamia, that area of the world, it changed hands many, many times. There were lots of different empires that controlled this region of the world, and it was a pretty valuable region of the world as far as history goes because of those two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates river systems. They made that area very fertile, and even on our map here we see it is a very green area on this map, which kind of represents the fertility of that region. We are going to fast forward from what we've learned in the past and focus on Iraq in more modern days, starting with around 1968. The reason why 1968 is important when we talk about Iraq is because that's when the party that has governed Iraq for a long period of time, the Ba'ath Party, took over. Now, for most of Iraq's history after 1968, it was relatively quiet until 1979, when a gentleman named Saddam Hussein came into power. And you can see right here we have his name. It's one of our important people or places or vocabulary terms that we need to be able to identify for our exam that is coming up. Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator who ruled in Iraq from 1979 till 2003, whenever he was removed from power. What we want to write for our definition here is just that. Saddam Hussein, brutal dictator, ruled Iraq from 1979 to 2003. Now, what came to happen with Saddam Hussein is that he ran a very harsh government there in Iraq. He and his government controlled the media. They restricted personal freedoms. And anybody who really disagreed with Saddam Hussein or his political allies, they became his enemies, and he killed really an unknown number of people. They are still finding mass grave sites throughout Iraq that came from during his time whenever he ruled Iraq. Under his leadership, Iraq invaded Iran, its neighboring country, in 1980, and that war dragged on for about 8 years. During that time, both countries' economies were heavily damaged and many, many people died. In response to this, it put Iraq in pretty tough times. They didn't have a lot of money. So what they decided to do in 1990 was to invade Kuwait. Saddam Hussein ordered the invasion and the occupation of this neighboring country, again Kuwait, in early of August 1990. Many of the Arab countries from the Arabian Peninsula were alarmed by this movement, and they called on the United States and the Western nations to intervene. Hussein, he defied the United Nations Security Council demands to withdraw from Kuwait by January of 1991, and that's when the Persian Gulf War began. And it was really a massive U.S.-led air offensive known as the Operation Desert Storm. After about 42 days of relentless attacks by this kind of coalition of countries who were attacking mainly from the air but a little bit on the ground, the United States President George H.W. Bush declared a ceasefire on February 28th. By that time, most of the Iraqi forces in Kuwait had either surrendered or fled. Though the Persian Gulf War was initially considered an unqualified success for the international coalition, conflict in this troubled region eventually led to the Second Gulf War, known as the Iraqi War, that began known as the Iraq War, that began around in 2003. Another key term that you heard me mention in that was the United Nations. The United Nations is actually quite a long definition, and I would encourage you, if you don't have this in your notes, to take a look in the back of your textbook to copy it out. I'm going to tell it to you right here, but it is quite long and it might be hard for you to get it all down. The United Nations is an international organization that focuses on facilitating cooperation in international law. It focuses on international security, economic development, social progress, and human rights and achievement of world peace. Really, the United Nations is all of these, or many of the countries throughout the world, and they kind of get together to help police one another and make sure that people are behaving correctly in regards to one another and trying to ensure peace. As you can imagine, that is a very difficult task. One of the tools that the United Nations could use against a country who is not behaving in a peaceful fashion is an embargo or a limit on trade. This is currently something that we're doing with Iran right now, the next country that we're going to be focused on in Lesson 4. Iran is attempting to create nuclear weapons. The countries of the world have decided that nuclear weapons are bad and they're bad for Iran. So they are limiting trade. They're not trading the Iranian people the goods and the services and the things that they need to survive in order to kind of influence them. They're putting these sanctions on them to get them to stop doing this undesirable act of creating nuclear weapons. Now, as I mentioned before, in around 2001, after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, 2001, the United States, under the leadership of President George W. Bush, that's George H.W. Bush's son, U.S. government officials believe that Iraq aided terrorists. We also believe that at that time that the Iraqis that they had some weapons of mass destruction, that they were attempting to build nuclear weapons, and at that time President Bush ordered that the United States forces attack Iraqi targets. That was in March of 2003. Again, this was a relatively short conflict as far as this part of the war went. We went in there and we were able to defeat the Iraqi army pretty quickly. Just in a matter of a few short weeks, Saddam Hussein's government was crushed. It fell apart. He went into hiding. He had many palaces throughout his country, and he was switching palaces pretty much on a daily basis. And then he was forced to even flee the palaces. When they finally found Saddam Hussein, they found him basically in an underground hole that he was kind of hiding out in. He was filthy, and the armed forces kind of hunted him down. They dug him up out of this hole and brought him to justice. He was eventually tried in Iraq, and he was hung for his crimes by the Iraqi people. What's kind of interesting is that the charges that he was tried for was for killing a number of Iraqi Shiites in 1982. It was about 148 Iraqi Shia were sentenced to death by hanging. They were killed, and he was charged and convicted of those charges related to their deaths, and he was sentenced to death by hanging, and his execution was carried out in 2006. And that was around the time, the war at that point had been over. There were still many kind of groups of Iraqi people who were still attacking American soldiers, and it's only recently in the past 2 years that the American troops were actually able to mostly pull out of this territory. Now, in Iraq, there are really two main ethnic groups who live here. About 75% of Iraq's population are Arabs. They speak the official language of the country of Iraq, and that is Arabic. And most of the people of the Middle East speak Arabic. There are some other languages that are mixed in there, but the majority of the people of the Middle East speak Arabic. The second ethnic group that lives there are the Kurds, and they make up about 15 to 20% of the population. They're mostly farmers. They live in northern Iraq, and these are people like the Shia people who live in Iraq. They are people who were treated poorly by Saddam Hussein under his leadership, and many of them were put to death for disagreeing with the government. Now, you should have already read this section in class. The section that deals with what is Iraq like today. It was on page 233, and if you haven't read that, you definitely want to take a look before you get to the quiz. There were 2 questions there that I asked you to complete, the questions really focus on how was Baghdad damaged by the war. The war was pretty brutal as far as Baghdad goes. They lost power, they lost running water, a lot of their homes and businesses were destroyed, schools were damaged, many of the antiquities, the things that were gathered by archaeologists throughout history from that Mesopotamia region were lost or stolen or destroyed during the Iraq War. It took a coalition of American and French and British troops to come in and really to help rebuild Baghdad. And even after American troops were done there was a lot of American companies who came in and they received contracts to help rebuild Baghdad, so as not to just leave these people who were relatively innocent. The majority of the public, they were innocent in these wars, to not just leave them high and dry. We went in there to help rebuild them and to kind of help to strengthen their economy, so that they wouldn't feel like we just came in and wrecked their place and left. In January of 2005, the country of Iraq had their first opportunity to participate in democracy. That was the time where they elected a National Assembly. And that National Assembly's first job was to go and to create a constitution for the country and figure out how is this new country, not new country, but how is this country going to be governed, and what type of government are we going to put in place. So that was a momentous occasion, and there were some really awesome, powerful pictures in the textbook. If you haven't looked at them, take a look at that of the Iraqi people voting. In this area, Iraq, unlike other countries, because they are such a fertile area, there were other resources that were there besides just oil. They can grow lots of food crops, lots of barley, lots of cotton and rice that can be exported to other countries. That pretty much wraps up our discussion about Iraq. Lesson 4 is going to deal with Iran, and we'll focus on that tomorrow, and then we'll be having our quiz shortly.